In last week's lecture about Reconstruction, we talked at length about the social landscape after the Civil War, particularly in regard to class. Okay, and I said at the end of that lecture that essentially what the Reconstruction era does, it is establishes a platform on which America experiences a tremendous amount of wealth generation, due in part from the legislation of the Reconstruction era, but also due in part to technological advancements and legislation that was passed before the Reconstruction era. So during this lecture, we've been talking about what are some of the causes for that massive wealth generation, and some of the impacts that that massive wealth generation has on the American social landscape. Okay, so to begin with, the Gilded Age is a kind of interesting name for this period of American history, partly because the definition of its descriptor. So gilded is an adjective, and it essentially means covered thinly with gold leaf. So in a way, this period of American history, we do see a lot of wealth generation, but the name suggests that the luster of this age is just a thin veneer, and rather the social ramifications of the Gilded Age are much more crucial. Okay. So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the second industrial revolution, why it's a second industrial revolution, not the first, which entailed railroads and industrial economy, development of industrial economy, and the legislation that supported that industry, as well as new corporate structures that emerged during this time. Then we'll talk about a little bit the social transformation that's predicated on this economic rise. Then we'll talk about the expansion of the Western frontier, and the removal of Native Americans from that land. And then finally, some of the labor resistance to the rise of affluence and industrialization during the end of the 19th century. So to begin with, we need to talk about the second industrial revolution. So the rise of industry in America is really predicated on 5 distinct factors, which led to the growth and affluence of American industry. So number 1, Western expansion. Okay, opening up Western lands opened up a vast number of resources which companies then capitalized on. For example, fertile farmland in the Midwest, which was later on used to grow corn and wheat. Similarly, nutrient-rich soil in the South. Super great for growing cotton. Lumber in the Pacific Northwest becomes an industry unto itself. Okay, mineral resources, including iron ore, coal, all throughout Pennsylvania, and the Appalachian Mountains. So the iron industry develops in central Pennsylvania as a result of the abundant amounts of easy accessible iron ore that can be then smelted into steel. Okay, so these rare earth metals, also silver and gold as well. And oil and natural gas. So at the end of the Civil War, other minerals lay unused or undiscovered across the country, including iron ore, coal, oil, gold, and silver and copper. And so during this time, corporations are beginning to capitalize on these unused resources because now the Western frontier is suddenly open. Okay, that's number 1. Opening the Western frontier opens up new resources to capitalize on. 2, a growing workforce. Okay. Large-scale factories that first developed in New England in the early 19th century and even in the 18th century relied on skilled laborers. Okay? For New England, industrialization centered in seaport cities along the Atlantic, including New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and skilled workers over time through the 19th century immigrated from Great Britain. Great Britain had long since industrialized by this point. Okay? So number 2, skilled workforce is necessary for the industrialization of America. Number 3, surplus capital. Surplus capital for building industries. So by this time, banks were extremely important instruments for mobilizing capital, for mobilizing money, financial assets. Before the Civil War, some bankers had begun to specialize in arranging financing in large-scale enterprises, and some opened offices in Britain to tap into resources outside of the country. So banks like JP Morgan's, right, they brought in surplus capital from outside the United States to invest into American industries. And so that's one of the reasons why American industries develop in this way as they do at the end of the 19th century. 4, the development of the advanced agricultural economy. So by the end of the 19th century, we have these technological innovations that produce new methods, more efficient methods of producing agriculture during this time. So the expansion of productive farmland was also accompanied by the development of these agricultural tools, which we'll get into. 5, lastly, we'll be talking about the way in which the expansion of the U.S. railway system underpins essentially all of these factors. Okay. So before the Civil War, the issue of slavery had blocked all efforts of economic development in the West. The secession of the South and the Southern states permitted the Republicans who took over the federal government to open up the West to economic development through various pieces of legislation that we'll get into, including the Pacific Railway Act, the Homestead Act, and the Morrill Land-Grant College Act. Okay, so these are pieces of legislation that we're going through one by one that are essentially engendering the opening up of the Western frontier. Okay. But before we get into that, we're going to talk about the expansion of the railway system. And to do that, we need to understand, how did people travel across the country before there was railways? Transportation was essentially water-based, essentially based on boats and barges on canals and rivers and along coastal waterways as well. Over time, however, the development of the railway system became self-perpetuating. The growth of the railway network stimulated industries that supplied materials for railroad construction and operation, including steel, coal, and iron factories. So the early development of these railway companies created industries unto themselves, particularly those industries that make a ton of money for a small amount of Americans that are invested in natural resources like iron ore, steel factories, natural gas refineries as well. This is all based on the development of the railway. Okay. So, in another way, railways also became a training ground for industrial professionals. Okay. So, I have 2 maps here that illustrate the growth of the railway in the United States. In the first diagram, 1830. We see the first stirrings of the American railway outlined in these small red lines. So one of the first railways to be implemented in the United States was actually in New Jersey, in Hoboken, New Jersey. And it wasn't used in practical terms to move commodities or even people, but rather for leisure purposes. It was essentially a carousel. Over time, the investors found more practical uses for railway technology in transporting goods to markets. And we see that development in major cities throughout the United States, particularly along the coastal regions, where trains can deliver goods, for example, from rural South Carolina to the Charleston port, where it can then be transported to New York or to Boston to be refined further. Similarly here in around New York City and the Chesapeake Bay area, as well as in the Boston area as well. So this is where the railways are starting to develop, so that by 1860 you have a large expansive network of railways stretching across at least the eastern part of the United States. These pieces of legislation, however, that we're going to be talking about were crucial in galvanizing this further. Okay. So the Transcontinental Railroad, constructed between 1863 and 1869, was really predicated on the Pacific Railway Act. Okay, the Pacific Railway Act, piece of legislation passed under Lincoln's administration, issued federal loans and grants to 2 specific railway companies: the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railway Companies. And the Pacific Railway Act was essentially a subsidy, federal subsidy, to construct a rail line between Omaha, Nebraska, and the Pacific Coast. Okay, and the reason for doing this was to connect the markets from the West Coast to Omaha, Nebraska, which then also had connections to Chicago by this time. Now, keep in mind, by 1860, Chicago was a center of transportation technologies by this time, right? So to connect the Chicago markets to the West Coast would be not only beneficial for private companies, but also beneficial for the United States in general to increase national power. So the Pacific Railway Act provided loans and grants of 10 square miles, later increased to 20 square miles, of public domain land. And usually this land was essentially confiscated from native inhabitants. Okay, so Union Pacific and the Central Pacific were also important because they also employed many immigrants during this time. So Union Pacific, for example, employed former soldiers, immigrant soldiers, also as well as free blacks and Europeans, mostly Irish at this time, and accounted for about 5,000 immigrant jobs during this time. The Central Pacific employed mostly Chinese immigrants, so it was a different workers' population. Similarly, there were about 5,000 to 6,000 people. So the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in May 10th, 1969, and it was a pinnacle of technological innovation by this time because, for the very reason that it connects the markets from the West Coast to the Central plains to the East Coast. So it provides a intercontinental or transcontinental connection that goods theoretically could be moved from one coast of the continent to the other. Okay. By 1871, Congress had issued approximately 70 land grants involving 128 million acres, more than 1/10 of the public domain. Between 1865 and 1890, the railroad grew from 30,000 miles of track to 167,000 miles in the mid-1800s. In the mid-1880s. Between 1865 and 1890, the U.S. railway grew from about 35,000 to 167,000 miles of track. All major rivers had been bridged. Companies replaced iron rails with more efficient, durable steel at this time, again, illustrating the important technological innovations during this time, spurring industry. And the development of the railway had also allowed to transport heavier goods, which meant more trading was being done throughout the United States. Also at this time, we see the development of specific marketing techniques to encourage not only transportation of goods, but the transportation of people across the country. So around the end of the 19th century, we see a massive migration of people. People are now able to move across the country to take advantage of the new opportunities, economic opportunities that are being opened up by railway and railway-spurred industry. Another piece of legislation to keep in mind is the Homestead Act of 1862 of the same year. So the federal government assisted in this expansion of productive farmland primarily through the Homestead Act, which gave land to people who agreed to live and farm there for at least 5 years. So in order to get a grant according to the Homestead Act, you had to fill out a ballot, right? Which meant you had to read. If you couldn't read, you have to pay someone to read. So the Homestead Act only benefited a certain minority of Americans at this time. But nonetheless, these minority of Americans were responsible for developing the western frontier. And most of the time, they were usually immigrants. Okay, so they're either immigrants from Europe. There are many Scandinavian immigrants, German immigrants, and Russian immigrants, but also newly freed African Americans after Reconstruction also took advantage of the Homestead Act. So between 1862 and 1890, the government issued more than 48 million acres of land. And like the Pacific Railway Act, this is land formerly held by Native Americans that was taken over by the federal government in the name of this idea of eminent domain or public domain, meaning that it's within the country's best interest to take over and seize this land from its owners. Okay. Nonetheless, there is definitely some benefit from the Homestead Act. New farming technology and the expansion of Western frontier yielded exponential amounts of corn. What happens as a result of the Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act is the development of bonanza towns. And to think about bonanza towns, or bonanza farms, it's essentially analogous to boom towns, if you've ever heard of this. And these are rapidly produced and rapidly developing towns throughout the western frontier, which become larger towns unto themselves. So Chicago, for example, starts out as a bonanza town, similar to towns like St. Louis or Kansas City, all bonanza towns or boom towns during this time that develop rapidly through the 19th century, through the end of the 19th century. Now, the third piece of legislation is coming on the coattails of the first two, and that is the Morrill Land Grant Act. The Morrill Land Grant Act essentially allocated federal funds and federal land to develop state colleges. Okay. But state colleges with the primary emphasis of developing technology to increase agricultural output. Okay, so it's a federal initiative to increase and support the economy by developing schools. Okay, and there are a number of schools throughout the country that are considered Morrill Land Grant colleges. For example, Rutgers. The University of Delaware is also a land grant college. This means it got federal land and aid to develop certain schools based on agricultural technology. Similarly, Cornell is also a land grant college. However, it's a hybrid private and public college, which means that part of its schools are private, whereas the agricultural school at Cornell is definitely a public school. Okay, as is the Industrial Labor Relations School. So those schools at Cornell, on the Cornell campus, receive land and aid according to the Morrill Land Grant Act. One last caveat here with the Morrill Land Grant Act is that each of the colleges that benefit from this piece of legislation have a Morrill Hall on their campus. So Cornell has a Morrill Hall, University of Delaware and Rutgers also have Morrill Halls. And that name is from Senator Morrill, who wrote and sponsored this legislation. Okay. Building on these pieces of legislation that open Western frontier and that really stimulate the development of railway technology, we see the increased competition of American industries and consolidation of American industries. So the linchpin of industrialization really rests in the hands of J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan, his claim to fame is the financial resources he's able to control, which allow companies like Andrew Carnegie's steel company and John D. Rockefeller's oil companies to develop exponentially during this time. And without that capital that primarily comes from Britain, these companies aren't able to develop as they are. So there's a term in American history called Morganization. So the Morganization entails the rapid expansion and development of railroads that required more capital than most manufacturing enterprises, which is where J.P. Morgan and his banks come into play. So the railroads, for example, had a huge appetite for capital, and that made them the most successful American business during the 19th century. Those who invested their money could choose to buy their stocks or bonds, and sales of railroad stocks provided the major majority activity in the New York Stock Exchange, providing the basis for the American economy during the 19th century. Financing the expansion of railroads paved the way for industrialization of the American economy, including stimulating investments in coal, oil, and steel, like the examples of Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, which we're going to get to in a second. Morgan's life is pretty interesting. So his father is a financial investor in the UK, primarily working with life insurance, Aetna life insurance. However, as an immigrant to the United States, J.P. Morgan is able to develop his own brand of financial services, primarily geared towards industrialization. J.P. Morgan attempted to stabilize the railroad industry, which was susceptible to cutthroat competition. In this way, he's able to gain a larger foothold in the American economy. So Morganization entails the way in which J.P. Morgan is able to marshal these financial resources, but particularly with regard to the negotiations that he has with these different companies. So J.P. Morgan, according to Morganization, is willing to give John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie, I don't know, $5 million to develop their industry. Okay, so that's part of his job as a bank, to give these industries financial resources to develop their companies. Okay, with interest, of course. But the other stipulation here that Morgan capitalizes on is that, yes, he's going to give them the financial resources, but he requires that one of his representatives in his banks sits on the board of governors of their corporations. So he can have a kind of tentacle, as it were, as this document illustrates, a tentacle or a foothold in those industries. So as those industries grow, his financial industries grow as well. And that's how J.P. Morgan is able to become so successful during this time. And as the cartoon illustrates, he has his hands in multiple different industries, from natural gas to shipping to coal refinement to mining to oil refinement to slaughterhouses, all of these. And underpinning all of these is railroad development, which is his first initial impulse. Okay. In 1875, Andrew Carnegie drew a large loan from J.P. Morgan and J.P. Morgan's father to finance the construction of the nation's largest steel plant in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which had 1,500 employees during that time. So with the financial capital that Carnegie was able to secure from the Morgans, Andrew Carnegie develops a specific type of a corporate model, which later becomes known as vertical integration. Okay, and Carnegie had a principle. He says, cut the prices and scoop the market. So basically, his deal here is to produce a more affordable product than his competitors can do so. Right? So cut the markets, cut the prices, scoop the markets, run the mills full was Andrew Carnegie's principle. And that essentially meant cutting the costs to profits by paying lower than his rivals, by producing products at a much lower cost than his rivals. By the 1890s, Carnegie became the largest steel manufacturer in the United States through his company acquiring more than 1/4 of the nation's production of steel. Okay. Like Morgan and the railroads, Carnegie and other entrepreneurs transformed the organization of the structure through their industry. So vertical organization is this kind of corporate model that Carnegie implements. And this entails joining a range of operations under one central leadership. So for Andrew Carnegie, that meant he's going to own the facilities that are extracting minerals from the ground. Okay, he's also going to own the production facilities that are refining those minerals. Okay, the minerals being iron ore during this time. He's also going to refine that iron ore into steel at this time. Okay, he owns those monopolies as well. And then he also controls the distribution and marketing of steel. Okay, so the leadership ensures steady operations. It gains a competitive advantage in order to cut costs from his rivals, and it guarantees a reliable flow of crucial supplies at predictable prices. And this is a specific kind of corporate model that Andrew Carnegie develops and others replicate that enable Carnegie and others to make a large amount of money. In 1863, J.D. Rockefeller uses Morgan's investments to invest in oil refineries. Okay, so in 1870, he invests and founds the Incorporated Steel Oil, Incorporated Standard. In 1870, he founds Incorporated Standard Oil, profiting in part off of the war contracts he developed during the Civil War, but also later on in the imperialistic wars that we're going to get to in the next lecture. And whereas Andrew Carnegie develops vertical integration, J.D. Rockefeller develops a different corporate model called horizontal integration or horizontal organization. So horizontal organization entails the merging of one or more companies with similar activities as a way of limiting competition and enhancing the stability of planning. So whereas Andrew Carnegie is investing and controlling all aspects of his industry, okay, J.D. Rockefeller is only investing and controlling one aspect of his industry. Okay, he can care less about extraction of oil. Okay, he can care less about the transportation and distribution of oil, although he does get into that later. Initially, he's mostly concerned with the refinement of oil. Okay, so he owns and controls a majority share of oil refineries in the United States, which enables his corporation to develop a controlling share and develop a lot of money during that time. So by 1881, Standard Oil, Rockefeller's company, controlled more than 40 oil refineries with nearly 90% of the nation's refining capacity. By 1890, Standard Oil maintained a virtual monopoly over the nation's oil production. Standard Oil monopoly dissolved when the new oil was discovered in Texas, called Texaco, in the Texas Gulf. Nonetheless, Rockefeller set a legacy that resonated for generations. He was able to gain a lion's share of the Texas oil production in the United States through developing a unique corporate model. So here we see the development of these railway industries creating a self-feeding cycle between the railway industries, the coal industries, and the steel manufacturing refinement centers. And these are centered in mostly urban areas like New York, like Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, and also Philadelphia, but also in places like Chicago. And so the industrialization of America also entails the urbanization of America, but a little bit later on. We're going to get to that in the next lecture. So these publications, illustrations, correspond to the fact that people were realizing that the tentacles or the magic behind the industrialization was not magic at all, but rather unique corporate financing models provided by people like J.P. Morgan. So with these financial models, J.P. Morgan and others were able to not only to control vast amounts of resources, but through their resources were able to purchase and control large amounts of property, lots of land, specifically in urban centers like Chicago and like New York. And so over time, the urban centers are going to reflect this grandiosity of the industrialization of the Gilded Era. Social stratification. So social Darwinism is a kind of popular philosophy at this time that is built on the popularity of Charles Darwin's discoveries in The Origins of Species, published in 1859, in which he found that in wildlife, competition fosters healthy growth of a species through natural selection. So similarly, people started to think about the terms of natural selection in human society as well. So social Darwinists contended that the competition among people and by extension among powerful entrepreneurs produced progress, right, through the survival of the fittest. So people not fit to survive in this new industrializing society were, suffering great hardship, right? And it was thought that they would just die off over time because of natural selection and survival of the fittest. So, understrained competition provided the best route for improving mankind and advancing civilization, the social Darwinists thought. And people like Carnegie also picked up on this as well, in espousing more popular philosophies based on social stratification. We're going to transition now to some of the more devastating consequences of industrialization, particularly regarding the Western frontier and Indian removal. Following the Civil War, Americans began to move westward, primarily on railroads and through the Homestead Act as well. Most white Americans considered the West to be largely vacant, when in fact it was actually densely populated by Native Americans. Before 1851, federal policymakers had considered the region west of Arkansas, Missouri, and Iowa, Minnesota, and east of the Rocky Mountains to be permanent Indian country. That quickly faded, however. By 1851, public domain policy for the Great Plains, the area west of the Mississippi River, was opened up this land for Western settlers. Okay, So Congress approved a new policy that designed in part to open these Central Plains as railway routes for the Pacific. And this is something we saw in the Pacific Railway Act. Also, the public domain policy promised each displaced Native American tribe a definite territory limited in extent and size even further west. Okay, so literally, this public domain policy relocated Native Americans. Okay, even further west from where they originally settled. The U.S. government also agreed to supply whatever needs the tribes would require that they could not meet themselves in their new relocated territory. So between 1867 and 1868, reservation treaties created reservations on the northern and southern plains and the southwest. Right? Okay. Still, some Native American tribes refused to comply with these terms. So the last time we saw William Tecumseh Sherman, he was adjudicating disputes in the Reconstruction era South. Okay. Soon after that time, however, Sherman was relocated and reassigned to the western frontier to adjudicate the Indian removal according to the public domain policies. Okay. Following the conclusion of the Civil War, General William Tecumseh Sherman was appointed departmental commander of the territory between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, right? And his job as commander of this area was to protect the wagon trails of settlers coming out to the west, okay? Between 1869 and 1876, he was appointed general of the Army, essentially the highest command that you can have in the U.S. military during this time. And Sherman concentrated on subduing the Western Plains Indians. So we see a major reversal in Sherman's role from facilitating peace between ex-Confederates and now free black Americans to now essentially quelling revolution under the hand of public domain policy. So this is a major role reversal for him. Sherman was very aggressive with his Native American policy. He directed his troops to, quote, destroy their villages and their horses and to kill and hang all warriors that would pose any resistance to the military and bring back the women and children so that can now propagate as well. So this map actually illustrates a lot of the Native American incidents of resistance. So this map actually illustrates some of the Native American resistance to Sherman and the United States Army's initiative of removing Native Americans and otherwise suppressing their citizenship. The Great Sioux War comes after 1874 when gold was discovered in the Black Hills in the Sioux reservations. Essentially, miners started invading Sioux territory, and also the Northern Pacific Railway had also planned a route through these parts of southern Montana. Okay, so the U.S. government was authorized to move the Lakota Indians from this area. And as they started to remove the Lakota Indians from this territory, they started to encounter fierce resistance from the Native Americans in this area. So once the U.S. military was called in to remove the Lakota Indians from the southern part of the Montana territory, there was immediately fierce rebuttal against the U.S. military. In the spring of 1876, U.S. military invades, igniting the Great Sioux War. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, one of the youngest appointed military generals in American history, leads a force of the U.S. Cavalry, the 6th Cavalry, ahead of the main forces and attacking this large Sioux encampment at a reservation called Little Bighorn River. Custer's forces were outnumbered, and his men were subsequently cut down. And Custer's last stand, was considered a rallying cry for the U.S. military and galvanizing support in using the military to suppress Native American resistance. So the Great Sioux War is a process of essentially suppressing Native American and specifically Lakota resistance on the western frontier. By the winter of 1876, the U.S. military advances and proceeds to cut down the remaining Native Americans. There are two particular Native Americans in particular that are leaders of the Lakotas at this time. There's Crazy Horse, who's a Lakota war leader, is a warrior, and also Sitting Bull. Look, Sitting Bull is not a warrior, but rather a Lakota holy person. And they were among the Lakota chiefs who operated in the northern plains, mostly in the southern part of Montana during this time, who fomented resistance against Indian removal. Okay. So Crazy Horse in the battles was killed after he resisted capture from the U.S. military. Sitting Bull, however, was able to escape up to Canada, where he remained until 1881, until he finally surrendered. Okay. Once he surrendered, he was hired by an entrepreneur named Buffalo Bill Cody, who essentially created one of the first traveling carnival circuses. And this is a specific carnival circus where he would recreate the Western conquest of the U.S. military and the suppression of the Native Americans. And so Sitting Bull's role in this traveling circus was to replay his own conquest, to replay and dramatize the genocide that he had experienced at the hands of the U.S. military. So throughout the rest of his life, he relived the massacre of his people again and again and again throughout the country, wherever Buffalo Bill would take his traveling circus. So Native American resistance didn't always entail military resistance. In fact, some of the strongest resistance to U.S. Incursion onto Native American land took place through dancing, actually. So the ghost dance is a phenomenon that starts in the 1880s as a form of Native American religious spiritual dance. And it held out the promise of an Indian messiah who would banish the whites and bring back the buffalo and restore the land of the Native Americans. Okay, so in the 1880s, the Lakota Indians resorted to a religious ghost dance to appeal to a kind of higher salvation. The ghost dance was also accompanied by chanting and lyrics that Native Americans would recite. So some of these lyrics might respond to the fact that the buffalo population, very sacred to the Native Americans, particularly the Lakota Native Americans, had been decimated by white settlers, and the ghost dance appealed to this higher form of salvation, which entailed a resurgence of buffalo, meaning that there was going to be salvation further on. And while seemingly innocuous, this ghost dance did present a kind of fear for U.S. military, because it seemed to lift the hopes of these Native Americans, particularly Native Americans who engaged in a long and protracted war on the western frontier. So fearing the ghost dance would incite Native Americans to further uprising, the government forces outlawed this religious practice. They outlawed Native American dancing. The implicit goal of the ghost dance was to reverse Native Americans' colonial position. Okay, so in November 1890, the 7th Cavalry was dispatched, the largest force assembled in the U.S. Army since the Civil War, to break up the ghost dance ceremonies and arrest the chiefs that were responsible for inciting this revolution. One captain of this U.S. Army said that Indians are dancing in the snow, and they're going wild, and they're going crazy. We need reinforcements, we need protection, and we need it now. Okay? In the ensuing melee, 2 of the police shot Sitting Bull in the head and the chest. Sitting Bull's teenage son and 6 of his followers are also killed, along with 6 Indian police in response. So the Native American resistance to the U.S. military wasn't always violent, but also took cultural forms as well. And we can see this in the example of the ghost dance, but ultimately what transpires from Indian removal was in tantamount to genocide of Native Americans. Another example of the social ramifications of industrialization in the United States takes place in labor disputes. Following the Civil War, labor disputes expanded exponentially, almost doubling by 1890. The labor force grew in most urban centers, concentrating around those manufacturing urban centers that we saw earlier in the lecture. Large-scale immigration. In the late 19th century, the workday in most industries averaged around 10 or 12 hours, 6 days a week. Okay? People were expected to work long hours, but found that industrial work controlled them rather than the other way around. Okay? So the origins of unions and labor conflict around this time centered around skilled workers who provided most of the successful labor unions in the United States. For example, in 1866, the National Labor Board unions, founded by an iron molders union, created the largest trade union in the United States. So unions were able to organize together to propose a resistance, organize together to form resistance against the oppression that many workers faced in industries, in the factories, for example. One of the great examples of this is the Great Railway Strike of 1877. So the story of the Great Railway Strike was that in 1873, a railway company reduced the costs and cut wages, as according to Andrew Carnegie's principles. By the summer of 1877, workers on the Baltimore and Ohio railroads went on strike, and they encouraged other workers on other railroads to halt trains and also similarly go on strike. In West Virginia, the governor sent in the state militia and the federal troops to end the strike and to restore service. Okay? And a similar thing happened in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when strikers shut down trains, and some of them disrailed trains. In Pennsylvania, the state governor sent in the state militia and strikers, state militia to push strikers back. And the federal troops burned down and looted the railway property throughout Pittsburgh, totaling $10 million in damage. Okay? So in this instance, the U.S. military was used to suppress labor unions. And the U.S. military was used, in other words, to enhance corporate profits and to protect corporate profits, because corporate profits were contributing to the affluence of American society during this time, or the appearance of American affluence. The Great Railway Strike of 1877 suggested that working people could unite across lines of occupation, across race and gender, and provided a precedent for labor unions to follow in its footsteps. Like the Homestead Strike of 1892. In 1892, in Homestead, Pennsylvania, one of the Carnegie steel plants managed by partner Henry Clay Frick, who we're going to encounter later in the Progressive Era lecture, there was another strike that took place. So labor unions here rejected the major wage cuts proposed by Frick in order to increase profits. So Frick immediately fired those that refused to work, and he hired non-union replacements. Okay. Frick also hired a private security firm called the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to force this labor shift and to suppress labor rebellions during this time. So what ended up happening is that there was immediate conflict between the Pinkertons and the laborers during this time, in which the laborers supremely outnumbered the Pinkertons and surrounded them. And the Pinkertons ultimately surrendered their arms and agreed to end their confrontation. After the Pinkertons surrendered, the Pennsylvania governor sent in the U.S. military again to suppress and quell this uprising. Despite their surging numbers and strength, labor unions were no match for the full strength of industrial corporations. And we see this specifically in the Homestead Strike, when Union soldiers essentially fired on labor organizers to suppress the rebellion during this time. By 1893, economic depression further weakened labor unions. But nonetheless, during the end of the 19th century, labor unions were responding to the overwhelming growth of industrialization and the social inequalities that they presented. So over time, we see a confluence between private industry and the federal government in the way that federal government is using the military to enhance the interests of the private industries, whether that be the railway companies removing Native Americans to the western frontier, or in aiding industries in suppressing labor strikes. The U.S. military steps in intervening on the side of corporate profits. And this is something we're going to see throughout the rest of the 19th century and into the early 20th century until we get to the Progressive Era, when there's activists that attempt to restore this equilibrium of democracy in America. So here are some of the key terms we need to keep in mind for this lecture. Standard Oil Company and the type of corporate model that the Standard Oil Company represents, whether that's vertical integration, horizontal integration. What is the ghost dance, and how does it represent a form of cultural resistance to Indian removal? What is the Homestead Strike? Okay. Morganization, you're going to need to know what that is. Social Darwinism, another popular philosophy you're going to need to know. What is bonanza farming? Who are the Pinkertons? Who is Sitting Bull? And what does this life tell us about Indian removal? You're going to need to know also those three pieces of legislation that paved the way for industrialization. Those are the Pacific Railway Act, the Homestead Act, and the Morrill Land Grant Act, all of 1860.